Welcome to Massey Dialogues. My name is Nathalie Des Rosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. Massey College is a place for ideas. It's a place that has permission to nourish learning and serve the public good. Massey College, the physical college, is located on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are very grateful for the ability to continue to congregate here. The Massey Dialogues was based on the idea that to serve the public good, we have to talk across disciplines and between generations. And that's what we're going to do today. Today we're talking about democracy. You may not know, but September 15 is the International Day of Democracy that the United Nations declared in 2007. It is a day that we're supposed to use to reflect on the role and the value of democracy and how the democracy has influenced or creates better communities. So I'm really delighted that today I will be joined by Sabreena Delhon, our new Open Democracy Fellow at Massey College, to discuss resilient and relevant public institutions. So this has been a subject of her expertise for many years, and we'll talk a little bit about whether democracy can be strengthened post-COVID. So I will also be joined by Shauna Sylvester, who's the Executive Director of the Simon Fraser University Morris Wosk Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and also by Junior Fellow Stephanie Bertolo. So I also invite you to write questions on the YouTube channel. I will put them to my guest as we move forward in the dialogue. So a few words about my guest first. Sabreena Delhon is the Massey's first ever Open Democracy Fellow. It's a role that was created with SFU, the SFU Morris Wosk Centre, and the Open Democracy Project to create a space for more in-depth relationships with Massey College on the subject of democracy. She holds an MA in Sociology from Dalhousie and a BA in Sociology from the University of Alberta. She pioneered really interesting work on access to justice and the perception of justice that we will be probably discussing at Massey in the coming months. Today we're going to talk about Open Democracy Project. What does that mean? Why does it exist? And what's the purpose of the Open Democracy Fellowship at Massey? She will be joined by Stephanie Bertolo, who is a second year in the Master of Public Policy program here at University of Toronto. In 2018, she graduated from McMaster with a Bachelor of Arts and Science and a minor in Community Engagement Studies. She served as the VP Education for the McMaster Student Union and is particularly interested in urban and health policy and how to ensure that public policy fosters equitable communities. She's a great junior fellow, really active at Massey College, and I'm so happy to have her back this year as well. And finally, we'll have Shauna Sylvester, who's the Executive Director of the Simon Fraser University Morris Wosk Centre for Dialogue. She's the co-founder of SFU Public Square. She's a social entrepreneur. She's done so much work on density, business development, international relations, transportation, energy. She just told us about a course, 7-week course on democracy that she just finished teaching. So she really is a leader in the field. She co-founded and served as the first executive director of Impact up until 2006, the Institute for Media, Policy and Civil Society. And also she was recognized as one of Canada's top 40 under 40 in 2003 by the Globe and Mail and also by the Business in Vancouver magazine in 2000. We're so delighted that we have you here. This is important to discuss democracy in the midst of COVID and in the midst of September as we return back to university. Let's start with Sabreena. Sabreena, I am so delighted that you're the first Open Democracy Fellow, but what does that mean, open democracy? Why is it necessary to have an open democracy fellow?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Nathalie. It's so great to be on the Massey Dialogues and such a privilege to be on this panel today. So I'll start with a bit of background about the Open Democracy Project. That's a nonprofit organization that's developed community-based programs that are aimed at demystifying political processes, and technology has played a key role there to advance inclusiveness. ODP is also a co-founder of Democracy Exchange, which is Canada's annual democracy summit. We're working really hard on that and looking forward to hosting it October 13th to 22nd. So right off the top, want to make sure people understand that they're all welcome to join. And to note that we recently launched opendemocracy.ca. And so that really gets at the heart of the fellowship and why it's necessary to be talking about democracy and openness right now. It serves as a platform to share community organizing knowledge and to explore what it means to practice democracy in the 21st century. So what we're trying to do through the platform, through the other initiatives, through the fellowship, is support what we're, what's been framed as an emerging democracy sector. And that's comprised of local change makers, policy analysts, researchers, activists, advocates, but also citizens. You don't have to do democracy for a living to be welcome in that space. And the emphasis on openness is really important, and that was the case before the pandemic. In terms of trying to reverse the democratic recession and push back against the decline of the expert and a decline in the legitimacy of public institutions. It's even more urgent now that we're viewing the world through a pandemic lens. And, we're seeing social movements with very long histories breaking through into the mainstream. So what all of this is aimed at is, acknowledging that we're at a critical juncture in terms of defining the next chapter for democracy in Canada, and we want to help support its development.
So really, both COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement are pushing, I think, our ideas of democracy. So it's particularly relevant to reflect a little bit on its role. How responsive? Isn't it one of the issues that democracy has been around for a long time, and it seems to have allowed injustices to continue for a long time and be a little bit invisible? So is that do you think that this is what we're talking about if we're trying to renew democracy, is going to be a greater focus on its inability to really effect change that ensure an equality framework?
Yeah, I think this moment is really about opening things up. For a long time, I think notions of democracy or the term democracy has been associated with political leadership or voting. And, it is about those things, but it's also about going upstream. We have an opportunity right now to look at how we can make sure that conversations that are shaping our society have representative participants, not just in the conversations, but driving the conversations. And we have an opportunity right now to evolve the practice of democracy so that we're addressing disparities related to health, wealth, and also justice outcomes in our society. So this is something that needs to happen at an institutional level, but we're seeing, an awakening or, a broader engagement at the community level, which is really, really critical in terms of the social movements. And just to note that, over the last 6 months, so much has changed. Energy has shifted, popular opinion has shifted. We're seeing mainstream engagement with concepts that were, just sort of within the domain of the activist circle or academic circles. And, there's been like a mass decentering of white privilege across democratic institutions, and there's no way we cannot continue to engage and respond to that. And, of course, this is back to school week here in Ontario. And we've seen the lead up to this moment prompt unprecedented organizing amongst parents, teachers, and community members calling for a safe September. And that's happened, across the country. Mm-hmm. what's interesting is that, that's significant, just that form and kind of intensity of organizing. But the fact that some of those Safe September groups, for instance, the Ontario Parents Action Network, have intersected their demands for a safe return to school for their children with other movements like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And so, this is a moment of awakening where people are reconnecting with their power and opening things up beyond just going to vote and then just not thinking about something for 4 more years. It's not that that's what was necessarily happening, but now that narrative and engagement is different, and we want to help support that.
But so how would you define the success for Operation Democracy, for Open Democracy? Is it that they want a larger number of people to feel engaged in the discussion, or is it getting more people to vote, or more people to run for elections, or more diversity of candidates? What success looks like for Open Democracy?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and we're in the midst of defining what that can look like. And certainly, identifying the different forms of civic participation is important, and that's a key deliverable to come out of this fellowship, is to capture who's in this space, what are their relationships with each other, and what does, effective mobilization and democratic engagement really look like. I think the standards for that are shifting right now. The expectations of what we want or understand from our institutions is shifting, and I think people's notions of themselves as a citizen is evolving right now too. And so we need to support this transformation, but we also need to, be conscious of its course and follow it and see where it's taking us.
Well, let's bring Stephanie in. So Stephanie, you just listened to this. Is that inspiring, or what does it tell someone who's studying a master in public policy about this changing? It looks like whatever you're studying is being changed under your feet.
Yes, definitely. Everything is changing very quickly. And I think this is also a great opportunity. We're seeing that in a lot of instances where as much tragedy that is happening, we can also use this to our advantage to improve democracy and modernize public engagement in ways that we haven't seen done, or ways that a lot of people have been advocating for over the years, but have never been put into practice. I know the digital transformation has taken so long, even though that has been necessary for people who have accessibility issues and can't necessarily delegate at a city council meeting or attend a public meeting. But those options were never there because I guess those were not barriers that everyone faced. But now when we can't get outside and we can't see each other in person, we've all moved online. And I think that's a great opportunity for a lot more people to become engaged who weren't previously engaged before.
So that you would see this as one of the transformation that COVID did, which now allow more people to participate through the use of technology. Are you concerned that there will be a return back to the old ways once a vaccine is found or the COVID crisis is over?
I don't think so. I think people were very scared to try things like this. We thought that people wouldn't be engaged if they were online. We heard that about working online or going to school online. And then I think we heard the same thing with like having political representatives not attending meetings in person. There was this big fear of disengagement or of other fears that maybe weren't founded. But I think now that we've tried it, a lot of people are like, this is what we want to do. And this is what we want to continue to do because it is working so well. And it does open up a lot more opportunities for people to be involved.
But how do we reconcile this move toward technology with what we know are digital divides in our society, where some people are pretty clever and pretty good at using technology and others have limitations because maybe they don't have Wi-Fi, or if they do, they're not don't have access to a computer as often as others. Is there almost in there a problem of inequality of access?
Definitely. Of course, we're seeing older adults are maybe less capable to use technology, maybe don't have Wi-Fi. I'm constantly helping my parents figure out how to use their iPads even though they've used technology for as long as I have. But I can imagine that it's very difficult for a lot of people. And we know that there's an economic disparity. Not everyone does have high-speed internet, and we need to start seeing that as a basic human right in a way, because it is so necessary to live in this society and be connected to the rest of the world, and we need to use the internet to do that. So I think we'll move to a hybrid model. I don't think everything will be online forever. At least I hope it won't be. But I think that we need to have both in order to provide everyone equitable access to different opportunities.
So one of the issues that Sabreena raised is that how the conversation has changed because of equality concern, and racism was raised throughout the summer and is now top of mind. Does that, and in a way, changing how people participate? They're in the streets, they're online, demonstrating, asking, and being more vocal about their demands. Nevertheless, I think one of the questions that always comes up when we think about democracy is, will that translate into voting? And if it does, that will bring change. If it does not, then will we be back in having a divide between those who vote, who have access to the channels, and other people who continue to be heard, but mostly in the background? Is that, and the young people we always look at the statistics, and it's they don't vote as much. And is that something that can change? Do you think it will change this time around after experiencing this summer?
I think it's difficult to say if it will change. I hope it will. I always hope that young people will get out to vote. When I worked for a student union, I ran 2 get out to vote campaigns. And I did see a lot of people who were really politically engaged and really excited to vote and having amazing conversations. And I do think that now that there are issues that youth are passionate about, that will probably be predominant in the coming elections, that maybe that will inspire them to get out to vote. But I think a major factor in why young people don't vote is because of the barriers they face. Youth are usually in a transitional stage in their lives, and there are a number of barriers that they face that the average adult voter doesn't face. For instance, I am now at school in a city that isn't my permanent address. So I would have to go back home to vote, or I'd have to change my ID to have my permanent address here, or find ways to prove my address here. And then sometimes you get to the voting station and you're still turned away because the people there aren't aware of your situation and immediately think that you're unable to vote there. So I think there are these extra steps that if the average voter was subjected to them, also wouldn't vote in the same numbers. So we really need to figure out how do we make voting really accessible for young people and a lot of people in different situations that maybe don't have stable housing, maybe are moving around, and how can we make voting a more accessible process for youth and everyone else?
Well, we'll certainly have to continue to think about that, particularly in light of the U.S. elections coming. Who's going to vote and what impact will that? Let's bring Shauna. Shauna, you have lots of experience internationally. I know you've ran projects that are speaking to the trends in democratic engagement and new ideas about democracy. What are you learning through your research?
Well, I think there's a number of things that we're learning. We've looked at 4 foundations really of how do people engage. And one of the things is we traditionally think about democracy and we think about the institutions. So it's that relationship between citizens and their institutions. And then there's been a lot of conversation about the role of the media and discourse and misinformation. And you see that amplified in the United States, certainly. So that's another area, another foundation. Civics education is huge, and the lack thereof is a big issue in this country. But the one we don't often talk about, which is also, I think, perhaps the most fundamental, is social connection. And we know through our research, the more connected we feel to our community, the more likely we are going to engage in voting in democratic activities. But the reality is, and this is to follow up something Stephanie said, is that 68% of us don't think it makes sense. That whatever we do doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference that elected officials aren't listening to us. Now that might have changed through the pandemic, because I think that and I do want to give credit to a lot of governments who have really tried to listen and respond deeply to what citizens are saying. They've achieved it in some ways. They may have fallen short in others, but they've been trying. And so maybe those numbers have crept up. I'm not sure. But this is a piece that we don't look at enough, is just how important it is, our relationship one to another. And the pandemic and all of the other things that we are going through. And right now, I can't look out my window without seeing smoke, the fires, just the levels of things that are going on in our community creates this incredible sense of anxiety for some. And it is those processes that have actually moved in and creating a sense of collaboration. I see you, you're not isolated, let me reach out to you. The emerging communities in my world, it's been in Facebook, that have come together and said, I'm here to support you. So I actually think that we could see some shifts that happen in that research on democracy, as people are finding new and more emergent forms of building those relationships of connectivity with one another. And that in turn could have a play in terms of how they feel about the country they live in, the community they live in, the province, the municipality. So we'll see.
So you're putting a pretty nice way of thinking about, we just realize our interdependencies basically between each other. I mean, there's nothing more a good example of interdependency than a pandemic, since if someone gets it, you might get it, and it's health, so it affects all of us. And we know that if we don't follow the rules, we may put in jeopardy other more vulnerable people in our community. So the interdependency and the connection, you see that as positive. Some people would be worried a little bit that has given us the anxiety as may force us to give more power to government that thereafter they will not want to relinquish. So there's a theory that emergencies create dictatorships. What do you think about that?
Well, and research would show that in the times of emergency, and this is that you can have both, that there is a tension. You can have people who work from a space of fear and scarcity, who want security and stability, and autocratic or even totalitarian style forms of leadership are more appealing. I fully expect, Nathalie, that exists. I know it does. But you can also have, at that same time, a different response, which is that for those communities in times of crisis, and I come out of working in conflict zones for 25 years, that those that focus in on building relationships of collaboration, who really try and address scarcity, who try and address fear, and to do it in a way that builds relationships, that builds social connectivity, can in fact create deeper forms and bonds of democracy. And I'll use an example. I remember when we had Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. We also had in Sri Lanka the huge tsunami. It was so fast for Sri Lankans to reestablish their communities and to recover. The resilience was so strong because the social bonds were so strong. That wasn't the case in New Orleans. So we can learn as much around how do you create, in times of emergency, really strong social bonds. Now, the next thing, and I want to go back to something else you asked, Stephanie, is, we always ask this question, why aren't young people voting? Why isn't it is far greater than just young people who are not voting.
Yeah.
It's those that don't feel that the system is supporting them. They don't see themselves in the system anymore. And that's why it's so important, going to what Sabreena's talking about, with this emergence of really looking at racial equality and justice. We are in a time in our democracy in Canada where redistribution and equity is absolutely fundamental to our way forward. And I suspect as young people start to see themselves in the system, that they can have a place and they can start to shape that, you're going to see them running more for office. They're going to be engaged. I'm certainly seeing it in my own backyard. They're going to be engaged in far greater numbers. This is the least apathetic community of young people I've ever seen in my history. I have never seen so many initiatives being created by young people in this country. They are not apathetic. They just want a system that is not elite. So too do rural people in Alberta want a system that sees and hears them. I'm sitting now in the United States, Nathalie, and I'm living right now in the States, just across the border from Tsawwassen, which is a community in Canada. And I went to Eastern Washington. I could not find one Democratic sign in all of Eastern Washington. Wow. And I turned to my husband, who's American. I said, "What's going on?" And he says, "This is rural Washington." And I said, "Yes, but the Democrats should have a very strong relationship with farmers around food security. I mean, there's a lot of issues around here that they should have deep, deep relationships." But what's happened in our politics is we keep saying that we only have to talk to these people. We only talk to these people. You don't have to talk to those people. We have to talk to these people. We don't have to knock on doors. We don't have to. And we become more and more focused on micro-targeting. And so the science of the election is miss the boat on democracy. It's the miss the boat on finding the voice and engagement with all citizens. And that's why this moment in time is a fascinating moment in time.
Well, I really like this, the science of winning, the science of electoral politics, missing the boat on democracy. It's quite powerful as a reflection on, but what's the outcome of this? You know, if we may want, and let's bring Sabreena and Stephanie into the conversation. Open democracy is about opening the doors, having more voices being heard. It's about challenging a little bit this science of electoral winning to make sure that everybody is heard. But at the end of the day, are we worried that the science of winning, the science of electoral winning will still continue to be the dominant paradigm, since there will be elections and they will be won or lost by the strength of the organizing? Or is that something that we should not worry about? Sabreena, what does open democracy? Do you agree with what Shauna just said, that it's almost like the electoral system is undermining the democracy, or the electoral politics is undermining the democracy?
Yeah, there's a big disconnect there, and it needs to be addressed, because I think we've reached the limit of how far we can go with this type of approach. And what we're exploring today is related to a reckoning in Canada with Canadian culture, because we've kind of always been able to get away with feeling like, well, that's how things are in the United States, we're different. But what we've experienced through the pandemic and through the current social movements is like, we've got some big problems at home. And if we don't act and protect what we hold dear, we're going to have some pretty significant problems. And just to add to the feeling of being heard and how that's like a key element of civic life for citizens, in the justice sector, there's research that supports or research that entails that when a person has a legal problem and they're navigating a complex system to deal with it, if they have a sense of agency throughout the process, they're okay, actually satisfied with the outcome, even if they don't get what they want. The fact that they're being heard and engaged is a key element of having trust in the institution. And this is something that people in the deliberative democracy space understand very deeply. Their focus is on participatory decision making, and this is, a key aspect of solving complex social and policy problems. They use participatory budgeting, citizen assemblies. Success stories were recently compiled in an OECD report. And the key trait in all of these approaches is time. We have to actually center local knowledge. We have to actually give a lot of emphasis and weight to good design. And so that, that disconnect you were just outlining, Nathalie, is really about, can we have a culture shift in these institutions, and can they respond so that they can be resilient by shifting their culture and do that internal work so that the public is seen as a resource and not a risk or something to just kind of dismiss because it doesn't fit within the micro crosshairs.
So let's bring in Stephanie. I just wanted to ask you, does that mean that we've been hearing a lot that traditional political parties, that participation in a political party is kind of not really what young people want, and that they want to express their democratic engagement in a much wider net? They're more environmentalist than they are linked to one political party. So are the political parties the problem? Or do they have to change? It looks to me, listening to Sabreena, it looks like political parties themselves should change. I'd like to hear all three of you about this issue. Stephanie first, maybe?
Yeah, I do think that political parties aren't working, and I think a lot of Canadians feel that way, especially young people. We have 3-4 major parties in Canada, and that can't encompass all of the political leanings of the entire population. And, only 2 of them really win, like 3 maybe win. It goes between mostly 2. So I think if you don't agree with those ones, you don't really know where you fit, how to express your political opinions, especially when you're working within a party where there is so much diversity and there's so much change. And that if you have a specific passion, that might not be encompassed by the party because they are prioritizing competing interests in order to win an election and satisfy their major voting blocks, and that doesn't always include young people. So I think that there's a lot of challenges, and I think we also saw a lot of young people very upset that the current government didn't move forward with changing the voting system. Yeah. I think if we had proportional representation or a different voting system, we would see a lot more political parties. We would see a lot more diversity and a lot more collaboration between parties. And that might inspire a lot more people to become more politically engaged because they see themselves better represented in their democracy.
What about Shauna? Is the electoral system the problem, or is that part of what you're finding out, or is that kind of a sidebar, a side issue, almost irrelevant?
No, it's definitely very relevant. It's time that we had electoral reform, and I was very disappointed when that wasn't forthcoming after the first time that the Liberal government came in and made that promise. But I think this is a tough one because I go through this myself. I don't have a political party all the time that speaks to me, and yet I don't believe for a second that stepping out of the process is going to serve my needs. So this is such a difficult tension. And I have this conversation with my kids. I have this conversation all the time around how do you deal with it? And so I actually really think that we need to do what Sabreena talks about and introduce a lot of those democratic processes, the citizen assemblies, and tie the relationship back between not just political parties, but government officials and public servants to citizens. And so really fundamentally get back to what is at the core of our democracy, which is engagement and voice.
It looks like we have a question from the audience. So maybe the question from the viewer, let's see it. It's what kind of effect does the failed process of electoral reform from the 2015 election have on voters' trust in the democratic process? I think we've heard from both Shauna and Stephanie on this. What about you, Sabreena? Are you disappointed? Are you going to vote again?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a huge trust issue and a big disappointment. We want to see that level of responsiveness. But it makes me think of recent research from the Rideau Hall Foundation and Abacus data that measured, trust and engagement with public institutions before and during the pandemic. And we've seen a big increase in confidence and an appreciation because those institutions have figured so prominently during the pandemic, and because we've seen a re-engagement from the citizens as well. So, where there's that tension again of, well, this group is kind of, turning away because they don't feel like they're being heard or connected. And then this group is sort of trying to connect, and we kind of are maybe missing each other is a generous interpretation of it. But certainly, we've got a fresh chapter ahead of us now because of the pandemic, as difficult and arduous as it's been, particularly for some communities more than others. So yeah, I mean, trust and disappointment, huge, but we have to keep going.
So is at the Democracy Exchange, is the issue of changes to the electoral system discussed, or are you more into a little bit more new voices and, let's go beyond the traditional idea of do we need MMP or alternative vote and so on? Is there an official position, or it's not yet?
Not an official position. We're a cross-partisan event. We want everyone to feel welcome, and certainly those are the types of issues we will be engaging. But in terms of what's shaping our program, it's around how can we strengthen democracy in the recovery from the pandemic. And so looking at these, more technical issues, these specific policy issues is a key aspect of that. But we are also working really hard to make it so that people don't opt out of these types of conversations. And when we make it very specific and technical in that way, that's still critical and important. There's a group that we need to bring together for that and grow, but we're working hard to keep the program also accessible to just the general public and people who are interested in what comes next for Canada, and that's all of us.
Yeah, but because that's a real tension, isn't it, between if you believe that we might have an election in the fall, we may have a federal election if indeed the government is defeated, and then we will be back at trying to decide which political party you want to support. Will the experience of interdependency, the experience that we talked about trusting more government, needing more government after a pandemic, will that? What do you think will be the impact on this? And then we could talk a little bit about how come this impact doesn't seem to be the same in the U.S. So what do you feel like people will be more engaged if there's a federal election?
Is that for me? Question? Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of trepidation. We're still in an emergency, and steadiness feels good right now. More change, I don't think, is something that people could really bear at this time. But if that were to happen, I think the presentation and definition of civic institutions and their future would have to figure really prominently. And I'm mindful with back to school right now that the need for substantial investment in our institutions is key. That's where civic engagement is learned and honed. And that's where those social connections that are so key that Shauna was describing, that's where they flourish. And if we're going to build trust in our institutions again, or establish a new chapter for them being more authentic, investment has to be a key piece of that. And that would be a key, at bare minimum, a talking point if there were another election. And, that's playing out in real time with the activation and anxiety that we've seen in the return to school and all of the organizing around public education and how we value that as a society and how that's reflected through funding.
What about you, Stephanie? I think the issue for people in the post-secondary institutions are huge. And what would be the key issue in a federal election coming up from your perspective?
That's a good question. Lots of important things going on. I think that we clearly are seeing a lot about climate change, even while we're in a pandemic. I think that is coming more to the forefront, and having a green recovery plan. Yeah. And I think young people are very passionate about that. I do think we'll want to see a national anti-racism strategy, talking about that a little bit more than we currently are. And I do think we want to see more support for municipalities and urban centers. I think that they are currently struggling, and there isn't as much federal attention on them as there should be as we're going through this pandemic. So I think those are some of the key issues.
What about you, Shauna? What would you see as the key issues if we were to have an election in the fall?
I think if I was really focused, I would say there are a lot of people who are suffering, deep suffering right now. Precarious employees, people who have lost their job. We're sitting with over 30% youth unemployment. We have a serious, serious issue of the kind of equity, the gender equity that we've established, losing all the ground in this period. So I want to know that if we're going into a federal election, that this isn't politicking, that this is clearly about government looking for the mandate to really support the people of this country, because there is a lot of pain. The number of small businesses that have closed in this country, the number of people who are employed by those small businesses. So those are really important. Stephanie's also talked about a number of really important issues. You cannot separate climate change. We are in a long emergency. The pandemic is part of it. The fires are part of it. And those will exacerbate. So this is a time of, in my mind, all of us stepping up to say, we don't just look to our government to solve this problem. We're in this. And how do we, in our actions as individuals, in our communities, in our relationships, in our networks, and in the way we act as citizens, how do we together take the responsibility to build the kind of relationships, the systems, the processes that produce greater equity, that do lead to the kind of resilience we need to create as communities, which includes addressing a fundamental issue of climate change. But as important, and I'm going to say as important, is looking at the employment and the economic justice that's going on in this country right now, because it's serious. They're both. You cannot take one and say they're not linked. They're absolutely linked.
It's been interesting for me as well. Yesterday in one of the conversation with an Indigenous leader, she was talking about the opioid crisis, and her despair was we jumped into action in the pandemic on COVID, but we never were able to do what was needed to deal with the opioid crisis. And she was presenting all sorts of hypotheses about why this is, why we do not identify with the sufferers of opioid and might identify more with the sufferers of COVID. So what's the problem with a democracy that seems to focus on some issues that and forget others? And we've seen that for as long as democracy has been invented, that it's good at solving some issues, but not issues that are unpopular or affecting people that we don't value as much. So, the failure of democracy to address racism is right in our face now. Does that mean that democracy itself is not the appropriate mechanism, or what's the reaction from you guys? From you women?
Opioid issue, because it's something it's an opioid poisoning issue.
Yeah.
This is fundamental. This is not an opioid overdose crisis. It's a poisoning crisis. 96% of the drugs on the street are laced with fentanyl. If this was our water and it was poisoned, we'd be acting like that. So we say that. So is democracy is an imperfect, we all know that. It's an imperfect system. But it is a system that says we are at the fundamental equal. We should, and so that we always have to fight for that. That's what makes democracy, for me, something I am willing to fight for and work for is to address those inequities, to constantly put that at the fore, to recreate, to renegotiate. And I don't believe there's any excuse for us not dealing with the opioid poisoning crisis. 140 people died in the month of May alone in Vancouver.
So there's a question from a viewer here. Shauna, could you reflect on your own experience in the 2018 Vancouver mayoral election and how party politics played less of a role and engagement was broader? So that's interesting. And then we can ask Stephanie about her impression of municipal politics. Yes, go ahead, Shauna.
Thanks, Tim, for that question. I did run as an independent. Yeah. And I did that, and I stepped into the mayoral election because I was deeply concerned. As you know, we've been working on democracy, and I had seen a trend that was deeply concerning, that the numbers of people who thought democracy was an appropriate way forward were on the decline, and those that thought authoritarianism or militarism was on the incline. And I thought, okay, the space in which you can work in this is local. Mm-hmm. And at a municipal level, Vancouver is one of the few places that does have municipal parties. Mm-hmm. But I felt that the party system was getting in the way of democracy in that context. Too much fragmentation, too much we're going to talk to our base and not talk to others. Mm-hmm. So I went as a mayoral candidate. Before I ever ran, I hosted 16 roundtables in people's homes, where the only condition that you could come to those roundtables is that you didn't care about politics or you didn't want to know about politics. Mm-hmm. And then I asked what's working, what's not working, and really sought advice. And that's how I started to build out the policies. I did 38 of those. I attended 37 mayoral debates in that context. But what I was really interested in doing is saying, could you reignite an engagement in democracy if you focused and worked with people in a local level? And I do believe nobody knew me, and I went to, I was within 4%. I came in third, and there was only 4% between the leader and me. So it was a fascinating thing to see the number of young people, of people who didn't ever vote, get involved. Mm-hmm. And it was fundamentally a practice in democracy. That's what I was trying to demonstrate.
But do you think that this experience obviously enriched everyone that was participant? Has it changed the way in which the city is run now? Do you think that it has sufficient impact in transforming a little bit the discourse?
What I would say is that campaign has launched a number, particularly of young women, mm-hmm. engaging in either getting involved in politics, running for politics. Mm-hmm. And there was a point at which there was a lot of pressure on me to step out. Mm-hmm. And it was a group of young people, women, all women said, you cannot. We have never had a female mayor in this city. It's been 136, and no women have ever won the mayor. You cannot step out, because what does that say to us? Mm-hmm. And so that was galvanizing in terms of, so yes, do I think it's changing the nature? Not on a day-to-day basis, not at all. Okay. But on who engaged and how they're now engaged, absolutely.
So what about you, Stephanie? You've been involved a little bit in municipal politics. So how does this experience resonate with yours?
Yeah, I do think municipalities or municipal governments not having parties can be very liberating. You don't politicians don't have to subscribe to the party ideology. They can listen to their residents a little bit more closely and enact those ideas more so than I would say people in a political party can at a provincial or a federal level. But I think at the same time, we see voter engagement at a municipal level is lower than at the other two levels of government. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, because of unawareness. Maybe sometimes it's easier just to vote for a political party when you know that, okay, I identify as a liberal, I identify as a conservative. It's much easier just to go tick that box off when it comes to voting time. When at a municipal election, you actually have to look at the candidates and delve more into their ideas a little bit more closely. But also we see that incumbents are elected so frequently that it also becomes so like disengaging. You know who's going to win sometimes. They can get 90% of the vote, and no one wants to run against them because they know that they're going to lose. So there's a lot of benefits to it, and I think it can be done a lot better. But there also are a lot of challenges that make people disengaged with municipal government.
So Sabreena, will Democracy Exchange talk a little bit about the running at the municipal level, and what are the possibilities and the best practices that are being developed around? Just full disclosure, I ran as well as a provincial MPP, so in a different, but certainly I think the ability of speaking people's home and asking them what they want is so essential, and so much fun, and so liberating. Lots of good ideas come from people who are on the front line experiencing what they have to do. So I want to hear about whether, I think that the Democracy Exchange is interested in almost training people to run for municipal elections, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Open Democracy Project has a resource called Democracy Kit that unpacks the different units that you would need to run a civic campaign or participate as a volunteer on a campaign. And hard skills civic engagement training is a key dimension of the Democracy Exchange program. In addition to our summit, which will be the first 3 days of our conference, we'll have a festival where different organizations can run workshops and training sessions, so participants can deepen their engagement and learn more about these types of things. And this is going to have a youth dimension to it as well, where we're going to be working with an organization called Civics, which is a big leader in this space in terms of hard skills training for civic engagement at the youth level. And in terms of just representation, and Shauna, it really resonated with me. You're sharing that experience of receiving being on one side of pressure and being told by this other group of women, like, what does it say to us if we don't see you in that space? I wanted to highlight the work of an organization or a group called Doctors for Defunding Police, which we recently profiled on opendemocracy.ca. And this is a group of doctors that have come together during the pandemic and built a social media audience of thousands, and they're leveraging their professional privilege with their local community knowledge to address systemic racism. Many of the doctors in this group are racialized. Some are the first in their families to be professionals. They are not satisfied with incremental change or being model minorities. They've got a new standard, and they're challenging institutions to rise to the occasion. And I raise them here because these are the kind of groups that are going to evolve the practice of democracy today. I don't know if a group like that could have existed a couple decades ago. They probably wouldn't have been able to have the critical mass, and that's really significant about this moment. 21st century democracy has faces and names and backgrounds that weren't able to gather in the way we can right now, and that digital organizing element is so crucial there.
Well, it's an exciting time to be discussing and thinking about democracy, and I know that the Massey College will be part also of the festival, trying to organize a session to continue and reflect more on what's going on. It's crucial. We're getting to the end of our hour here, so I'm just going to ask you to just maybe, what's the next good conversation that we should have on democracy, and what would you want the audience to remember from this dialogue? Shauna.
I think a big conversation we need to have right now is on what's happening with fragmentation and what's happening in communities. It's never okay to say that there are people you don't talk to. We need to be engaged in having conversations with every community, every person in our community. And the more that we can do to really stop the polarization, the fear, the fragmentation, the more we can do to build those relationships and that resilience in our community, because we have those relationships, the better. And so that to me is I'm really interested in how do we create a resilient society based on an ethic of care too.
Yeah,
that's critical for democracy.
Good subject for another good Massey dialogue here. So Stephanie, any thoughts for our audience as we close?
Yes, I think this is a great time to be watching how democracy evolves. And I think this is a really important time for citizens to get involved and find ways to make change, whether that's through political organizing or if it's through protests or demonstrations, and really getting involved in whatever way possible to move into a society after COVID that is more just and more equitable than it was before.
Sabreena, last word to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I would note that it's important to acknowledge that struggle is inherent to democracy. So the fact that it's hard doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that we're in a period of transformation. And I'll point to the work of Professor Hari Han at Johns Hopkins University, who is, doing a lot of important work capturing this moment and what it means, and projecting where we can go next. So struggle is part of it, and we have to accept it.
Well, so we will struggle on and continue to reflect and think about some of the big issues that were raised today. I want to thank you, Stephanie, Shauna, and Sabreena for being part of the Massey Dialogue. I also want to thank our audience out there for good questions, and also for the team at Massey College who puts these dialogue out. So to Matt and his team, and to Abra, thank you very much for doing this. And I hope to see you soon. So we'll continue to think about this big subject. Merci. Thank you.